Welcome to 8 Limbs. I'm your host, Drayton Michaels. Today we're talking with Dr. Jessica Hekman, and we're going to be talking about genes and behavior. Dr. Hekman is a PhD, and she is a graduate from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, with a focus on genomics, hope I'm saying that right, genetics, and bioinformatics, concentrating on animal sciences, and also a graduate of Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Jessica Hekman, welcome, and thanks for doing this. How are you today?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. Well, let's jump right in. My first question is, I'd like to have a nice, cogent answer as to why genes are not passed on like carbon copies, because there does seem to be a little bit of confusion among certain dog people that genes are passed on with exact coding.
Yeah, so there's sometimes when a gene is passed from parent to child, there can be a mutation, and I'm not sure if that's what you're asking about. That's actually pretty rare. The other thing that happens is that obviously you get, half your genes from your mom and half your genes from your dad, and so they're going to interact differently in the puppy than they are in the mom or the dad, because there's sort of a different genetic background for them. But I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at with this question either.
Well, one of the common misconceptions in dogdom is that if we have this line of dogs that are bred to do this specific thing, that all the puppies in that particular litter are going to come out with, more of that particular trait. And it's been discussed. I've talked about this with Dr. Karen Overall, and there's a number of other resources where the vast majority of dogs bred to do XYZ don't actually end up doing that, even when they were bred for that purpose. And, in that particular time period, that's why they were bred. Obviously, these days, dogs that are bred for a purpose of working, etc., aren't necessarily going to do that because we're in the 21st century. So it's along those lines where, some people just think, hey, I have German Shepherd from this line, and they're going to be like all the other German Shepherds.
Right. Yeah, so there's a lot going on with why we'll just take your example, with why the German Shepherds that we have today share some traits with the German Shepherds of some number of decades or a century ago, but not all the traits that we might expect. And so one reason for that is, as I said, you get some of your genes, some versions of your genes from mom and some from dad, but they interact in really different ways. And so just because the genes that you get from dad are the same as half of dad's genes, it doesn't mean that they're going to produce those same traits in the offspring, because when you mix and match between mom and dad, the traits, particularly in these really complex traits like behaviors, are just going to manifest in different ways. And I think what we're coming to realize in genetics recently is how very, very many genes affect behavioral traits, such that it's just really hard to control them genetically. It's sort of like if there could be dozens or even hundreds of genes affecting a particular trait, and a couple of those, well, they're all going to be different between mom has one set of those and dad has one set of those, and so then the offspring are going to have a mixed up set of them, and they're all going to interact in different ways. It's not this sort of straightforward thing where you're like, well, dad's like this and mom's like this, so baby's going to be an average. As we know, you can take in humans, you can have a very tall dad and a very short mom, and the kids are not all going to be exactly halfway in height, right? Some might even be taller than dad. So just the way that genes interact together, I think, is a lot of what's going on, and a lot of why you don't get exactly the dog that you expect when you breed two parents. And the other thing that's going on with a lot of really complex traits, and I think the best example for this is herding dogs like border collies, is a lot of these traits you have to select for really strenuously in each generation. And if, as time has gone on, you're not actually strongly selecting for dogs with herding ability, it used to be if a dog didn't have herding ability, it didn't get bred. And so then the large proportion of border collies did have herding ability. And these days, if you're selecting a dog more for something like agility or performance in the conformation show ring, a couple generations of that, and the dog is going to lose the herding ability because you're not selecting for it anymore. You're selecting for something else. So does that answer your question?
It does, and quite well. I mean, I don't know if there is a very succinct answer because there are a lot of variables. I mean, ultimately, the 1 or 2 word short cogent answer I give people is because genetics are a crapshoot. It's chance, and that's just the easiest way to explain it. We'll get into some more specifics later, and a lot of one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the mitochondrial DNA comes from the mother, and that the father, while genes are passed on, is more like a vessel. I mean, not to downgrade sperm and all, but it really doesn't do as much as people might think.
Huh.
Is that not accurate?
I'm not sure. Well, so mom is passing on. So mom and dad are both passing on one copy of what we call genomic DNA as different from mitochondrial DNA.
Okay.
And the genomic DNA is where most of the traits that we care about in dogs are seen. So mitochondrial DNA mostly has to do with things like energy metabolism. And so if your mitochondrial DNA is screwed up, you will see some very alarming diseases, but it's going to have a lot less to do with things like coat color and head shape and behavior and stuff like that. And so that kind of information strictly comes half from mom and half from dad.
Good
so I think
know.
I'd push back a bit on saying that the mom contributes more because she contributes mitochondrial DNA. I mean, dad, remember, contributes the Y chromosome.
True.
So in male dogs, they're not getting that from their mom. But the other thing that I'd say is we are starting to come to realize more and more recently how much is in the egg, right? And so mom isn't just contributing DNA, she's contributing this entire egg cell, which is much larger than the sperm cell, much more complete.
And that's what I guess that's what I was getting at,
Yeah, maybe that's what you were thinking of.
Sure.
And that cell comes with a lot of proteins already, and so that is very much the cell that is sort of going to become the baby with the contribution from dad. On the other hand, because science keeps changing, right?
Sure.
And so on the other hand, we're also starting to realize that dad actually is contributing more in the sperm than we thought.
Good. Nice.
By the way, I learned recently, and this was a surprise to me as well, because we like to the things that we learn in introductory biology are 100%. But it turns out that dad does sometimes contribute mitochondria, just many fewer of them, and they sort of get diffused out. But there sometimes are mitochondria in sperm, which I was like, what?
Yeah, because that is kind of a dogma, right?
In college, right?
That is kind of a dogma.
But sometimes he does. And then there are actually other substances in the sperm that it turns out may actually have some importance, and we are just now starting to figure out what those are. And that is not my area of expertise. It's interesting, but I sort of don't want to try to give any more details than that because I think I'd screw it up. But I guess I'd say sort of wait and see that maybe 10 years from now we'll start saying, oh, there's a lot more than we thought in the sperm.
Sure. And I just learned a whole bunch too. And I think that's really important in any discussion about behavior, genetics, biology, anything in neuroscience, is that it keeps changing, and there is a lot of information to gather and remember and apply, right? Because that's a big part of it too.
Right.
Just because us humans take stuff in. I mean, I learn stuff all the time, and I'm like, okay, I guess I understand it, but I need to figure out more about the application. So with that said, let's talk about heritability. And you and I sort of had a quick email exchange about this, and you gave me some, challenges that you face when explaining this. But again, if we could just talk about heritability and how it's really about, about the amount of variability versus the number of genes, which I think is a common misconception as well.
Yeah, I actually was. So I was thinking about that question, and trying to figure out. So when you say number of genes, and maybe this is what the misconception that you're getting at. So there's a pretty much set number of genes in the dog genome. It's very similar to the number of genes in any mammalian genome. I think the current count that we've identified, although we're starting to question exactly what the definition of a gene is, but the current count is somewhere around 24,000. So pretty much every dog is going to get those 24,000 genes, one copy from mom and one copy from dad. And so the number of genes that the dog gets from mom and dad is not going to vary significantly. So maybe is it possible that you're saying that there's a misconception out there that, for instance, that a dog that is taller has more height genes or something like that?
Well, I don't want to sound like a fanboy, but my reference point is Dr. Robert Sapolsky. So what he says is that heritability has to do, the number of genes passed on, heritability, the true definition has to do more with the variability of the genes that are passed on. Heritability as a number does not tell us what genes have to do with the average level of a trait or a behavior, but actually what the gene has to do with as a number is the level of variability around that average. So, there's that dogma that, 53.5% of all genes are inheritable, right? So, but it's by chance and it's by random, like we said earlier, there's a lot that goes on. So that's the meat of the question is that,
Yeah. I guess I'm still not 100% following what you're asking. So my definition of heritability is when you're looking at a trait, the behavior, so like aggression is always the favorite one that we like to think about because no one likes that. So, and then you have a population of dogs. So say you have 100 dogs and some are more aggressive and some are less aggressive. And then you want to say, well, how heritable is aggression? And then the question that you ask is, if I know how aggressive the parents of these dogs are and the grandparents of these dogs, then I can do a calculation to tell me how much of the aggression in the population is due to genetic factors and how much is due to environment. So that's the definition, at least it's possible that Sapolsky, who, by the way, I am definitely a fangirl of as well. I massively respect him. It's possible that he is using a different a definition based more in biology, which is he's coming more from the biology side. At this point, I'm coming more from the genetics side.
Sure.
But it's also possible that I'm just not understanding the context in which you're reading the quote.
Well, his
but I would say that when you're talking about actual genes in the genome, that they're all passed on in the sense that the offspring gets them all. The real question is how much each gene affects a particular trait, and that is where I would think about heritability.
Right, and I think we're on the same page. Maybe just like you say, there's a different context. What he's saying is that genes don't determine the average of heritability. Genes determine how much variability there will be, and that's the purpose of the 53.5%. So that might be, So that might be getting at. I mean, I'd sort of want more context for the other sentences around that, but I think that what he might be getting at there is that when we talk about heritability, as I said, we're talking about a group, so like a population of dogs, and what people really want is for heritability to tell you, with my particular dog that I'm looking at who has some kind of behavioral issue, is, whose fault is it? Is it the fault of the genetics or is it the fault of the environment? And heritability doesn't say that for a particular dog. It says it for a population. It says overall in this whole population, we expect that for this particular trait, the genetics had more of an influence or that the environment had more of an influence. But it doesn't tell you for one particular dog in that population. It just says for the whole population. Got you. Yeah, and
so,
that makes sense.
I think that's what you're getting at.
I'll send you the link to behavioral genetics too. It's a fun hour if you have the time.
Okay.
Okay. So, how about an overview of epigenetic development, and let's discuss about splicing enzymes, transcription factors, and talk about that chance. Just to reference Sapolsky again, he says, fertilization is about genetics and development is about epigenetics.
Yeah, so I think what he's saying there is that at the moment that the egg is fertilized, the DNA from mom and DNA from dad come together, and the genetics then are determined, and they will be the same for the rest of the animal's life. But as the animal develops, so what we're particularly interested in is the brain, right? So I'll just use this as an example in the brain, although epigenetics affects every tissue in the body, not just brain tissue. But so let's think about it as a puppy going out into the world and having experiences. And the interaction, so when the cell is looking at the DNA inside the cell and trying to figure out how to use it and which genes are the genes that it's actually going to be using as instructions for its cellular processes at a particular time, the cell is going to have access to some genes and not to other genes. Because DNA, the genome is sort of like a book where some of the pages are glued shut sometimes. So, and some of the pages are easier to access maybe because the book sort of falls open naturally at those pages. And so epigenetics is about that access to those different parts of the genome, to different genes. And so as the puppy is going through life having these experiences, the DNA, the overall structure of the DNA, not the sequence, the A's, C's, T's, and G's, but the physical way that the DNA is packaged up, allows the cell to access some genes more easily and other genes with more difficulty. And that's going to change how the cell behaves. So epigenetics controls that packaging and which genes the cell's able to access. And in the case of the brain, it's the body's experience that is affecting how that packaging is going to turn out, how epigenetics is going to control gene access.
Nice. That's a great way to put it. I've never heard it described like that, but that makes a lot of sense. And going back to chance and not exact coding, when you're talking about some of the pages open easily, some are glued shut, that's again underscoring, that it's not dog. Like I always tell people, dogs aren't clocks. So,
right. Yes. So, much more complex. Than that, right.
Biological systems are complex. So let's discuss proteins because that ties in with fertilization and the chance factor that you were talking about. And again, not proteins like meat consumption, but proteins within the cellular development and how important that is to DNA and gene structure. And even if there is a small difference in those proteins forming that, the end result in the gene can be quite dramatic.
Yeah, so there's two possible things you could be talking about here. So you let me know what you mean. So one possibility is when I was talking about the structure of the DNA, of the actual genome, and so how there's easier to access some genes than others, that is because the DNA is physically wrapped around proteins called histones. And the structure of the histone is what, or little markers that are stuck onto the histone, is what makes the DNA in a particular area have open pages and in another particular area have glued shut pages. So that is one way in which proteins affect the function of the cell and therefore the end traits that we see very dramatically. The other thing that you might be talking about is how what a gene actually is for is its code to create a protein, and the protein is basically, some proteins go off and act as little robots basically inside the cell and are what make the cell function. And so if the code in the gene is different, then the protein, in other words, that little robot, is going to function differently. It's going to function better or worse. Therefore, the cell is going to function differently because its workers are more or less efficient. And therefore, then at the end trait that you see at the higher level is going to be different. So those are that's two very different answers to your question, I guess.
And they both apply. I both of those answer the question. So that's awesome.
Great.
I hopefully everyone can follow along with that. So there's been a lot of research, even, allegorical data based on observing animals in one environment or one setting. And again, we talked about this in another email, but again, referencing Mr. Sapolsky, when you control for environment, you artificially inflate.
Dr. Sapolsky, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Sapolsky.
No worries.
But when you control for, this is his quote, when you control for environment, you artificially inflate how important genes are. One setting or one circumstance, and genes will get more credit for behavior than they deserve. Just looking at for some context here as it relates to dogs, because again, it goes back to dogs bred for XYZ, and yet we know the vast majority of dogs bred for a purpose don't end up doing that due to all the variables. So if you could just give a little context to that, because a lot of behaviors or a lot of traits that are attributed to dogs have only been observed in one environment. Yeah.
It's hard. It'd be really nice, right, if you could take the same dog and sort of restart them and test them and see if raising them in a different environment would have made the difference. It'd be nice if we could go back in time. It would make research a whole lot easier.
Or even just take that dog who has this particular expressed trait in this one environment and see if those traits get expressed in other environments. that are similar or not similar, because that's the thing, like, especially going back to everybody's favorite questions, everybody's favorite topic, but it, the concerning topic, aggression and behavior is contextual. We know that. That's a hard rule of behavioral science, that it's contextual. So yeah, I mean, a lot of times, we want a lab because we've seen these labs do this and we want that. And then they get that dog, they get a dog even from that line, etc. So yeah, if you could add some context to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think one important thing to recognize is that when Sapolsky was talking about those studies, remember he comes from his initial background is working with primates in Africa, non-human primates in Africa, but his background after that more recently has been working with laboratory mice, and a lot of the examples that he gives are about working with laboratory mice. And I think that what he was talking about in that particular example was that the laboratory environments that we raise mice in, so the environment can be so unbelievably strictly controlled and so sterile. And so to take a really extreme example, you might have mice that some of them are kept in total darkness all the time, right? And some of them have normal light-dark cycles. And so you would expect that you would see behaviors in these mice kept in total darkness. You would expect to see some behaviors in them that you wouldn't see in the other mice, or vice versa, right? There might be some maybe nest-building behavior or something that mice don't do in the darkness. That's just a random example that is probably not actually held up in the real world. But my point is that in the laboratory setting, these environmental differences can be really massive. And so I think on the one hand, I want to caution against taking that quote and applying it to dogs, because while from our perspective, the environment of a working dog versus a pet dog versus a dog out on the street, from our perspective, those are massively different environments. And of course, they are massively different environments, but they're not quite so massively different as the environments that you get when you start going into laboratory settings. So, and that, which is what he was really talking about. But on the other hand, because this is part of the problem with behavioral genetics, is that there's always this interplay between, is the environment more important or genetics more important? And so, of course, environment is massively important to how a dog's personality is going to develop. And what I think where I'm falling on this right now is that early environment is super, super important, which is why I made the example about going back in time, that it would be that in a lot of cases, dogs' personalities may not be structured as much by genetics as we think, but they may be structured very much by early environment, by which I can mean being in the mom's uterus. There's a lot of early learning that happens there, being in the nest with the other siblings and interacting with the other siblings, even when they're just 3 or 4 weeks old, earlier than humans are really doing a whole lot with them. And so that by the time we're starting to work on socialization, there's already a lot of personality that's been set. And then, of course, as we all know, socialization, so there's some amount in which that early environment is very, very important, and then some traits will be very hard to change later on in life. But then, of course, dog trainers recognize that there's a lot of traits that are changeable. And then part of the question is, well, how do we know ahead of time, right? Why is it so hard to change some traits and not other traits? And I think all the things that we've been talking about here are in this very complex interplay into figuring out whether genetics or environment have more of an effect on a particular trait. And it's something that we're very much still studying. But your point, I believe, is that you shouldn't presume that just because a dog is in one environment that he will behave exactly the same as he would in another environment. I think we all know that's just not true, and we see that frequently in shelter dogs when we give them a behavioral assessment in the shelter and they behave one way, perhaps really terribly, and then we send them home and they do just fine. So dogs in different environments absolutely can behave quite differently. So not really a solid yes or no answer to anything, but
right. And that's usually that's usually the way to go when it comes to behavior, unless there is a specific context with a specific dog, etc., that we're assessing. There is a lot of it depends. I agree with you 100%. Obviously, with early development, even in the uterus, in utero, that's extremely important. Obviously, in the context of dogs who fight other dogs in an enclosure, usually 16 by 16. There are lots of stories of dogs way back in the day, before traffic and all that, and living in colloquial Massachusetts, running the streets and being rounded up to go fight dogs on Sunday down at the docks, but they, were not generally a nuisance out of that context. Or if we look at herding dogs, dogs who would, on cue or however they were, cued to go chase down cattle and bulls and grab them or nip at them or whatever. Or even dogs like ratters. There are some fantastic videos. I'll send you some links to these dogs who are like a team of dogs who go to farms to root out rats. And I wonder if those dogs, don't have any problems with the farm cats, or other animals. So they're,
right.
for me, context. And again, I'm a student of Gene Donaldson and Dr. Karen Overall and Dr. Susan Friedman. And, context to me, context changes can be subtle, macro, or micro. So, we have examples of dogs who do these particular things for whatever reason. And then outside of that context, there may be environmental stimulus that's similar, but for whatever reason, they have the inhibition to not do it. And I could go off about why I think this and that, but it's that's kind of what I'm, getting at with that, just because dogs are, supposedly able to do something, the environment really does hold the key to the dog's entire suite of behaviors, and even if they're known for one thing. I'm a little cautious with personality because I think personality is related to environment. I've met dogs who I was told were shy of men, and in 15 seconds they were loving me, and that has a lot to do with having their history and, making certain changes. But, personality, again, it's one of those labels where breeders use it for, these dogs have this type of personality, and they may, but they may not because of that early development. Okay, so, we've kind of been bouncing back and forth on this subject, but, would you say that overall, when you're looking at behavior, if you're assessing it, if you're, creating a training plan, etc., that it's really about the environment and not so much about focusing on the dog's genetics?
I think it's a question we would all love to have the answer to,
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we really do. I think that in the case of, in anyone's case, environment and genetics are a really complex interplay, and trying to say that one is more important than the other, environment and genetics have interacted to make the animal the way that they have, and which isn't to say that the animal is always going to be exactly like we expected a German Shepherd to be, but it is to say that the genetics have been very, very complex, the environment has been very, very complex, and they have interacted in complex ways that we still are not even really beginning to understand. I think in most of our pet dogs, I still think of environment and genetics as really sort of a 50-50 interaction. I think that if there is a particular trait that we have a problem with, in most dogs, that trait can be worked with and modified. I do, possibly because of my background working with the Russian Tame Fox Project, I'm very aware that genetics can, in some rare cases, have a stronger influence than that. And we might just call those pathologies rather than a normal personality trait. So the Russian Tame Fox Project, for those who don't know, is a project in which foxes were bred for many, many years, more than 50 years now, selectively bred to be either very tame or very aggressive. And it has been demonstrated, there was research that showed that it really was the genetics that made the aggressive animals aggressive, and that, being raised by a tame mother didn't do it, and you can't take the aggressive animals at a young age and carefully socialize them and expect them to be just like the tame animals. The genetics really does have an effect. And however, when we apply those to dogs, I think we do need to remember that those foxes were bred for one thing, only one thing, for 50 years, and that is really not the case in any of our dogs, any breed. There's breeds like, I'll go back to border collies again, which for a long time were bred almost entirely for herding ability, but there was still selection for other things, right? I mean, there was selection for health. there was certainly selection against aggression, right? A dog that was a really good herder but bit people also wouldn't have been a dog that was selected for. So there are really no normal cases of dogs that are really selected just for one thing. So I would say that normally there's an interplay. And if you really do choose to breed really just for one thing, then genetics can start to overpower environment, and it can be very hard to overcome some of those traits in that case. But for the most part, I'd say that it's really an interplay between the two.
Okay. So one of the questions that I pose is, let's say, you have a dog and you're sure of its breed and you're sure of its lineage and all that, and you never put the dog in the context with which it was bred to do whatever it was bred to do. I mean, it's possible that you may see those traits come out in other ways. Depends, again, on how much those traits, like you say, are kicking in versus the environment. And that's why I always lean towards the environment. I mean, I know genetics obviously aren't something that you can discount, but again, in my field of doing behavior analysis, it's almost irrelevant whether we discuss the dog's genetics at all. My interest is to prove to people that dogs are not a slave to their genes and that behavior can be changed, and that environment and context really is more of an important tool, because we can work with that. I can, if I know the information that I need to have in order to keep the dog's behavior sound and, or reliable, then I can control the environment and the context for the dog by and large, or at least how I respond to it if it's, environmental stuff that I can't control, which is why I stress that to people all the time, is to just focus on human behavior and the environment. Because overall, we don't know what the dog is thinking or what's happening internally all the time, but we do have a pretty good read about what has occurred in the dog's behavior history and how we can, apply training or behavior modification or even environmental management. I
don't think we're disagreeing, actually. I had a conversation with a veterinary behaviorist at a conference one time where she was talking about, if you have this dog and it's in a pet home and it's hyperactive and difficult, and then it's in a farm home and it's fine, and is that genetics or is that environment? And we started getting actually kind of irritated with each other because I kept saying it's genetics and she kept saying it's environment. But it's the same thing, right? It's sort of like, well, it's genetics because the trait is there to manifest, but it's environment because it only manifests in one environment. And I 100% agree with you as well that the traits that we're working with in normal dogs are very malleable. So I think you are quite right to not think about genetics in the case of you're presented with a dog, there's a problem, and you're asked to try to fix the problem. Try to fix the problem. And I think a lot of dog people sort of come at the question of well, if it's a genetic problem, then it can't be fixed. No, that's not true. It's a genetic problem because it appeared, right? If there was no genetic predisposition for the problem, it wouldn't have appeared in the first place. But that doesn't mean it can't be fixed. It just means that you need to change the environment so that the trait manifests in a different way. So
Agreed.
I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah. Well, again, I work at defending pit bull terriers, even defending them from people who supposedly love them and know them. And one of the large questions in that culture, even from people outside of it who don't, advocate for these dogs, is that some of them, quote unquote, like to fight. And, we've talked about this before, and you helped me clarify some things that I had been thinking about. But, it's my hypothesis that these dogs who can go back and do that, or even herding dogs, because herding is a stressful and potentially dangerous event, the dogs that go back to do it are doing it because, as you said, their brains are more finely tuned for those type of stressful contexts. And, that's where I wish we could, call in a neurobiologist. I'm actually hopefully going to be speaking with one soon from the University of New Hampshire. But that's my assessment of all the information I've taken in, is that these dogs who go back to do that type of stressful stuff are just, as you say, are more finely tuned. And that could be a product of, and it more likely is a product of, both genetics, and they just got the right number of neurons to process stress, and they got everything they needed to go back, because, as we know, farmers or dog fighters, they don't really have a whole lot of patience for dogs who are reticent, and we've all had that dog who's, afraid to go down a hallway or into a crate. And, those of us who know how to be humanely assertive and do some counter conditioning and desensitization and all those things, we can work through it. But, farmers aren't going to, if the dog doesn't want to nip at the cows and they're scared, they run away, then they can go hang out with, the washwomen and so forth. And the dogs who don't want to fight, well, back in the day, they sold that dog as a pet, and at some point it became, well, the dog's a liability, we have another mouth to feed, and they would just unfortunately kill dogs who didn't want to do it. So that's really where I'm focusing all of this information about genetics and behavior in the environment. Most people aren't worried about collies that are chasing stuff unless it's children or cars. People are worried about pit bulls on site, and there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of falsehoods that get attached to them. And one of them is, all of a sudden, people know about genetics when pit bulls get brought up, but they didn't know about genetics a minute ago. So.
Right.
Well, thanks for being here today. I really appreciate all the information you provided, and I'm sure that those who choose to listen to this episode of 8 Limbs will get a lot of new insights. Thank you very much for your help today. Is there anything on the horizon that you're working on, or anything that us dog geeks should be aware of?
So the new laboratory that I've just joined has a very cool project called Darwins Dogs, which is trying to understand the relationship between genetics and behavioral traits in dogs. And people can and should check it out at darwinsdogs.org. We're trying to collect both behavioral questionnaires from people, and then we send out kits to get saliva swabs from dogs for us to take a look at their DNA as well. And we are trying to get as many people as possible to sign up and tell us about their dogs and let us collect their dog's DNA. And it's fun. So that's definitely what I would point people at.
Nice, very cool.
As the sort of the coolest citizen science dog project out there right now, I think.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and we really appreciate your information today on 8 Limbs. Thanks for listening, everybody. My name is Drayton Michaels, and it's been my pleasure to bring you this interview with Dr. Jessica Hekman. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you out there on the internet. Take care.